When winter falls over a mountain town, the world grows quieter than it should be, as if the snow itself is holding a secret. On nights like this, a single bark can break the silence and change everything. This story begins in a storm of white silence at a funeral no parent should ever stand in. A loyal old German shepherd suddenly senses something no human can feel, and what happens next will lead a father into the heart of a mystery hidden beneath the ice. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. I would love to see your town in the comments. Winter settled over the northern edge of Wyoming, like an old spirit wrapping its wings around the mountain town, quieting everything beneath a blanket of white that seemed older than memory. Snow drifted down in slow spiraling feathers, muting the world into a holy stillness. Pines stood tall like ancient guardians, their dark silhouettes softened by frost, while the wind moved between them in long, mournful breaths. On the hill overlooking the town's frozen river and shuttered houses stood the small cemetery, its rows of stones half buried beneath the season's deepest snowfall. And in the center of that muted world, beneath a canvas tent trembling softly in the cold wind, stood Mark Ellington. Mark, 38, carried the kind of presence that came from years of bearing both duty and loss. A tall white man with broad shoulders hardened by patrols through storms. He had a square jaw slightly unshaven and eyes the gray-blue of winter water. His posture, normally steady with the quiet authority of a sheriff who knew how to calm a town, now bent under a weight no training could prepare him for. He had always been known as a man of integrity and discipline, someone who lived by the belief that he must always stand when others could not. Yet today, even that belief struggled against the raw ache hollowing his chest. Next to him stood Helen, 35, a soft-featured white woman with warm eyes now dulled by sleepless nights. She had always been the gentle force in their home, patient, steady, the kind of person who could calm a room simply by entering it. Before Evan's death, she was the woman neighbors trusted with their children, someone whose kindness felt instinctive. But grief had drained the warmth from her face, leaving behind someone who looked as though winter had carved a mark into her spirit. She clutched Mark's hand with fingers stiff and cold, not from the weather, but from fear, as though letting go would mean losing the last connection to the family they were supposed to be. At Mark's right side lay Ranger, the German shepherd whose legend still lingered in the sheriff's department. Ranger was 10 years old, his fur graying around the muzzle, his once black saddle now faded to a smoky charcoal. He was large, muscular, but tired, his gait slower these days, from the countless missions he had served in his prime. Yet his eyes, intelligent amber flecked with gold, remained sharp with the unwavering loyalty that defined every breath he had ever taken. Once, he had been the department's most decorated K9, known for saving hikers lost in blizzards, tracking criminals across icy ravines, and guarding officers with a devotion that bordered on spiritual. Retirement had not softened him. It had only given him a quieter purpose, staying close to the family who had given him a home. There were a few familiar figures among the mourners, neighbors bundled in thick coats, officers standing solemnly with hats pressed against their chests. But one man drew Ranger's attention more than the rest. Miles Carter, a newly hired funeral assistant in his mid-20s, stood stiffly near the corner of the tent. A thin white man with a narrow face, uneven stubble, and nervous eyes that darted rather than settled, Miles looked like someone perpetually afraid of being noticed. His shoulders slouched as if he were trying to fold into himself, and he held his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles had turned pale. Mark had met him only briefly during the paperwork for Evan's body. Miles had spoken with a soft, unsteady voice and avoided eye contact, though Mark had assumed at the time it was simply discomfort around grieving parents. Now, in the hush of the funeral, something about the young man's posture felt off, not in his grief, but in his fear. The priest's voice drifted through the air, low and somber, as snowflakes settled on the tent roof above. Helen's breath trembled with every word spoken. Mark kept his gaze down, unable to look at the small white coffin resting at the center of the tent. It felt too final, too silent, too impossibly cold. That was when Ranger moved. His ears snapped upright. The fur along his spine rose. His muscles tightened beneath his winter-thick coat as a low sound vibrated from his chest, a sound that did not belong in a funeral. It was not sadness. It was warning. Mark, startled, looked down at him. Ranger's nose hovered above the snow, nostrils flaring sharply. He sniffed toward the coffin, then away from it, turning instead toward the mourners, his head swinging with quick, searching motions. The growl deepened, a rumbling note rarely heard from him, even during his service years. Mark's heart tightened. Ranger was not reacting to Evan. Ranger was reacting to someone alive. Mark knelt slightly, resting a gloved hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy," he whispered, but Ranger paid no mind. He moved forward, pulling firmly against the leash, guiding himself in a slow arc around the coffin before halting directly in front of Miles Carter. The young man stiffened, his breath fogging in front of him as he took half a step back. Ranger growled louder. Miles's eyes widened, darting to Mark, then to the coffin, then back to Ranger, as though something inside him had come undone. Mark rose slowly, every instinct sharpened like a drawn blade. Ranger never misread a scent, not once. The dog's growl shifted into sharp, sudden barking, short, urgent bursts meant not to threaten, but to alert. Miles flinched. His face went pale enough to match the snow. Helen tightened her grip on Mark's hand. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ranger never reacts like this. What's happening?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't, not while Ranger's amber eyes locked onto Miles with a clarity that sent cold through Mark's veins. There was no confusion in that stare, no hesitation, only the unmistakable signal Mark had come to trust for years. Danger, deception, something wrong. The priest paused his words, and murmurs spread among the crowd as Miles stepped back another inch, nearly slipping on the ice beneath the snow. Mark took one slow step forward, not to confront, not yet, but to position himself between Ranger and the others, when something subtle but unmistakable shifted in Miles's expression. It was not grief. It was not fear of the barking dog. It was the fear of being seen. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly, and his gaze darted toward the cemetery gate as though weighing the distance, measuring how fast he could run. Ranger barked again, sharper, higher, the kind of bark he reserved only for living targets. Mark felt a chill settle inside him, not from the snow, but from a realization that scraped the edges of his heart. Ranger believed something about Miles, something dangerous enough to pierce through grief itself. Helen whispered his name again, voice breaking with worry, but Mark kept his eyes on the dog, seeing in those amber depths a truth that left him cold. Ranger was not mourning. Ranger was warning. The wind rose suddenly, rushing across the cemetery with a whip of icy air that made the tent fabric snap like a flag in a storm. Snow flurried sideways, and for a moment, the world blurred white. When the gust passed, Miles was trembling visibly, his breath sharp and shallow. Ranger lowered his body, ready to spring if needed, and Mark instinctively placed a hand on his holster, not to draw, but to steady himself. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. And for the first time since Evan's death, Mark felt something besides despair stirring inside him. He felt suspicion. As the final prayer closed and people began to step away, Miles lingered near the coffin, wringing his hands, shifting from foot to foot, like a man trapped inside his own heartbeat. Ranger refused to look anywhere else. His growl had faded into deep breaths, nostrils pulling in the scent of a secret no one else could sense. Mark watched the young man, with growing unease. The snow swirled around them, thickening with the promise of another storm coming down from the ridge. And in that heavy, unbroken silence, Mark felt the first flicker of a truth Ranger had already recognized. Something about Evan's death was wrong, and Ranger knew who smelled of the lie. The storm deepened over the Wyoming Valley as the day faded into a bruised blue dusk, smearing the sky with streaks of violet and pale gold. Snow drifted over the narrow streets of the small mountain town, softening the roof lines of wooden houses and muting the world into a hush that felt both sacred and suffocating. The funeral had ended only hours before, but the ache of it clung to Mark Ellington like frost on his coat. Inside the sheriff's office, a modest timber building warmed by an old iron stove, he sat alone at his desk, staring at the thin stack of documents related to Evan's death. Each page felt like a fragment of a truth he no longer trusted. The room smelled faintly of pine logs and cold metal, familiar scents that usually steadied him. Tonight, They did nothing. Ranger lay beside the desk, his head resting on his paws. The aging German shepherd watched Mark with steady amber eyes, sensing the turmoil shifting beneath the surface of the man he had followed through countless winters. Ranger had changed since the funeral. He was quieter, more alert, as though some invisible thread was pulling his instincts taut. And Mark, who had learned long ago to trust those instincts, felt the weight of that tension like a hand closing around his ribs. Mark's fingers traced the edge of the death certificate, the paper too smooth, too clinical for something that had torn a hole in his life. Listed cause, cardiac arrest during sleep. Time of death, 2:11 a.m., signed by Dr. Laurel Jennings. There was nothing outwardly questioning, nothing sloppy or suspicious in the words. Yet. He exhaled through clenched teeth. Ranger lifted his head. Mark didn't speak to the dog, not yet. Instead, he reached for the phone and dialed the number of Mountain View General Hospital. After several rings, a woman with a calm voice answered. "This is Dr. Jennings." "Doctor, this is Sheriff Mark Ellington." He hesitated, shame brushing his voice. "I need to verify some details regarding my son's report." There was a pause, soft but weighted. "Of course. I'm so sorry for your loss. What do you need to know?" "The time of death," Mark said, voice low but steady. "Could you confirm it for me?" 2:11 in the morning, she replied gently. "We recorded it immediately after the nurse performed the final check." Mark swallowed. "And when was the body transferred to the funeral home?" "Just after 4. Another pause. "Sheriff, is something wrong?" He stared at the certificate again. The funeral home's intake report, signed by Miles Carter, listed the arrival of Evan's body at 5:48 a.m. A 2-hour difference, unexplained. "Doctor, was there any delay in releasing him? Any mix-ups?" "No, everything followed protocol." "Thank you," Mark murmured, ending the call before she could ask more. Ranger rose, walking to Mark's side as though summoned by the silence that followed. Mark knelt and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's neck, breathing in the scent of old fur and snow. "You saw something, didn't you?" he whispered. "Something I didn't." Ranger nudged his shoulder. The knock at the door broke the moment. Officer Tom Briggs stepped in, brushing snow from his jacket. Tom, 36, was a tall black man with a steady build and a face carved by years of early patrol shifts. He had warm eyes but carried a natural seriousness. A man shaped by responsibility and a quiet moral compass that rarely wavered. Tom had known Mark since academy days. He had also been the one to help carry Evan's coffin that morning, jaw tight with grief for his friend. "You asked me to pull the funeral home footage," Tom said, voice low. "There's a problem." Mark stood. "What kind?" Tom handed him a flash drive. 14 minutes of footage is gone, between 5:32 and 5:46 a.m. Mark's pulse kicked. "Deleted?" "You can see the feed before and after. The camera just cuts out." Tom lowered his voice further. "That's the same window when the time of arrival doesn't match the hospital's report." Ranger let out a low huff, ears tilting toward the men as though listening. Tom leaned on the desk. "Mark, I need you to tell me what's going on. You're not sleeping, you barely talked at the funeral, and Ranger, he's acting like he's back on duty." Mark hesitated, then told him about the cemetery. Miles. Ranger's reaction. The way the young man looked like a trapped animal. Tom's expression darkened. "You think the kid had something to do with this?" "I don't know," Mark said, "but I know Ranger wasn't wrong." Tom paced, rubbing his jaw. "All right, let's go talk to the funeral home. Maybe Miles left something behind." But when they arrived, the building was dark. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the room smelled faintly of chemicals and sterile cold. Ranger moved ahead of them, tail low but body sharp, sniffing the air with focused sweeps. His behavior shifted quickly, alert, searching, determined. In the staff room, they found Miles's locker half open. His jacket hung inside, his name tag tossed on the bench. Tom picked it up. He left in a hurry. Mark opened the next locker, empty. The next, empty. The next, empty. When he reached the last one, Ranger pawed anxiously at the metal door, whining. Inside was a crumpled shirt and the faint smell of something sharp, chemical, unfamiliar. Ranger sniffed it, then looked at Mark with an expression that was almost human in its urgency. "He reacted to Miles," Mark said quietly. "Not to the coffin, not to the grave, to him." Ranger moved toward the hallway, nose close to the ground. He stopped beside a long stainless steel cart with wheels, a body trolley. Mark pressed his hand against the cold metal frame, his stomach turning. "This is what Evan was placed on," he whispered. Ranger whined, sniffing harder, circling the cart. Then he jerked toward the back exit door, pulling on the leash with sudden force. Tom blinked. "He wants outside." They stepped into the alley behind the funeral home. The night was colder than before, bitter enough to numb the skin in seconds. Snow had buried most of the ground, smoothing out potential footprints. But Ranger wasn't looking for prints. He was following scent. The dog paced in a slow arc, nose skimming the snow's surface. He stopped at the tire tracks of a small utility van, partially covered, but still visible. Mark crouched. The metal of the van's parking spot glinted faintly. He touched the outline with gloved fingers. Cold, recently used. This was Miles's work van. Tom inhaled sharply. So he didn't just leave. He left with something. Ranger growled softly, not a warning, but an urging sound. Mark stood. His voice came out raw. "Tom, he didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because he was scared." "Scared of what?" Mark's face tightened, grief clashing with a dangerous spark of hope that he didn't dare embrace. "Of whoever took Evan." Tom stiffened. "Mark, I know how it sounds," he said, stepping back, snow crunching under his boots. "But Ranger doesn't signal the dead. He only reacts to the living." Ranger looked up at them, breath puffing out in white clouds. His eyes gleamed with certainty, and the world seemed to tilt. "Mark," Tom swallowed, voice unsteady. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Mark didn't answer, couldn't. Not while the truth was still only a thread held together by instinct and desperation. They rushed back into the funeral home. Mark's voice cracked as he shouted, "Open the coffin!" He sprinted into the cold room, steel tables, humming refrigerators, and yanked open the storage unit where Evan's coffin should have been. The chamber was empty. Tom froze. "No, no, no, this can't—" But it was. The coffin was gone. Miles Carter was gone, and Evan, God, Evan, was no longer where he was supposed to rest. Mark's legs nearly buckled. Helen's cry from earlier echoed in his mind, ripping something inside him. The room spun. Ranger let out a single sharp bark, piercing, urgent, unlike anything he had voiced at the funeral. It wasn't mourning. It was the sound he made when he found the scent of someone alive. Night clung to the mountains like a second skin, heavy and unmoving, as if the darkness itself were listening to the panic rising inside Sheriff Mark Ellington. The discovery in the mortuary's cold room, Evan's missing coffin, had torn through him with the violence of a knife. Now, as he stood outside in the freezing alley behind the funeral home, snow swirling around him like breath from an invisible giant, the world felt unreal, too still, too silent, too wrong. Ranger sat beside him, chest rising and falling with deep, alert breaths. The German shepherd's coat shimmered under the dim security light, thick with winter fur, nostrils flaring as he tasted the lingering scent of fear, chemicals, and something sharper, something human. Officer Tom Briggs stood a few feet away, hands shoved into his gloves, jaw tight. The man's stoic nature had crumbled the moment they discovered the empty chamber. His eyes, normally calm and observant, now flashed with disbelief and anger. Mark forced himself to breathe. "Miles didn't take the coffin," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Someone took him. Someone took Evan." Tom shook his head, pacing in the snow. "But why? Why steal a baby's body? Why drag a mortuary attendant into it?" Mark whispered the possibility he had not dared voice aloud until now. "Because maybe Evan wasn't dead." Tom froze, staring at him as though the snow had turned to fire. "Mark, don't do this to yourself." "I'm not," Mark said through clenched teeth. Ranger reacted at the funeral, not to the coffin, to Miles. Tom exhaled, realizing that arguing was pointless. Ranger had led them through frozen forests, had saved officers from collapsing mines, had found lost hikers when even GPS signals failed. When Ranger reacted, you listened. A gust of wind swept through the alley, rattling the metal door behind them. Ranger lifted his nose to the air again, sniffing toward the van's faded tire tracks, half buried under fresh snowfall. "Let's move," Mark said. "We follow everything we can." Inside the sheriff's SUV, the engine grumbled to life. Snow crunched under the tires as they pulled away, leaving behind the cold building that now felt tainted with secrets. 30 minutes later, they reached the police station. A white-haired woman waited in the lobby, Sarah Madden, the town's senior dispatcher. At 63, she was short, broad-shouldered, with sharp brown eyes and a personality forged by decades of handling panicked calls with iron calm. She wore a knitted burgundy sweater, her silver hair pinned in a bun that had survived thousands of emergencies. Her husband had been a firefighter killed in a forest collapse 20 years earlier, a loss that shaped her tough, unsentimental nature. "Mark," she said firmly, her voice the kind that could quiet a room. "Miles Carter never showed up for his shift tonight. His landlord reported he moved out without notice. I checked the traffic cameras. His van left town heading north. No return." Tom let out a low whistle. "So he ran right after the funeral?" "No," Sarah corrected. "He didn't run. He fled." Mark's mind sharpened. "Send us the exact timestamp of his departure." Sarah hesitated. "There's something else. He bought gas at the northern station at 5:30. The clerk said he looked pale and kept looking over his shoulder." "Terrified," Mark whispered. Sarah nodded. "Like someone was watching him." Ranger chuffed, restless. Mark strode out of the station, Tom and Ranger following. The northern road cut through thick woods and climbed into the hills. If someone forced Miles to drive, the van would leave traces. "Bring his clothes," Tom said suddenly, jogging to grab a bag from the back seat. Inside were the abandoned items from Miles's locker: the shirt, name tag, and gloves. Ranger sniffed them, committing the scent to memory like a soldier studying a map. Snow deepened as they drove north. Clouds smothered the stars, pressing the night lower. Pines lined the road in endless rows, dark columns marching toward the mountains. After a mile, Ranger lifted his head and barked once. Mark slowed, headlights slicing through the swirling snow. Ranger pressed his nose to the window, tail rising stiffly. "He smells him," Mark said. They marked the location and continued. At the gas station, an elderly attendant named Cooper Reeves came out to meet them. Cooper, 70, was wiry, with sun-weathered skin, a crooked nose from an old rodeo injury, and eyes always half-narrowed as if squinting at a memory. He had lived through 3 blizzards, 2 divorces, and 1 lightning strike that left his left hand trembling slightly. But among the locals, Cooper was known as a man who noticed everything, even the things no one wanted him to. He wiped his glasses with a cloth. "That funeral home, boy. I knew something was off." Mark pulled closer. "Tell me." He drove in shaking. Looked like he'd seen a ghost or owed the devil money. When he paid, he dropped the bills, hands trembling so bad I had to help him pick them up. Tom asked, "Did he say anything?" "Only that he needed to get out before it's too late." Cooper's voice lowered. "Said someone was coming for him." Mark felt the breath leave his lungs. "Did he say who?" "No, but he kept glancing at the back of his van, real protective, like he had something precious in there." Ranger let out a sharp, urgent bark. Cooper startled. "I know that bark," he said quietly. "Used to hear it at mountain rescues. That dog's tracking the living." Mark met Tom's gaze. They understood each other with the speed of 2 men who had fought storms together. Miles wasn't the mastermind. He was the messenger. Back in the vehicle, Ranger paced on the back seat, never chaotic, but with the deliberate anxiety of a tracker who feels the trail slipping under falling snow. Mark put the SUV back into gear. "Let's check the forest pull-offs. If Miles panicked, he might have stopped." For nearly an hour they drove through the winding mountain road. Snow smothered the world into shades of white and gray. Their headlights skimmed past frozen creek beds, old fences half collapsed under ice, and long shadows between the trees. Then Ranger barked, loud, insistent. Mark stopped immediately. The dog lunged to the door. Tom swung his flashlight, sweeping the roadside. There, beneath a thin cover of snow, were faint tire marks cutting off the main road toward a maintenance trail. The trail was barely recognizable, overgrown and unused, the sign half rotted and leaning sideways. Ranger caught the scent, Tom murmured. They followed the narrow track slowly, branches scraping the SUV. After several 100 yards, they found it. A patch of disturbed snow. A footprint, small, hurried, with a drag mark as if someone stumbled. Bits of black fabric, and a faint chemical smell that burned cold in the air. Tom exhaled sharply. Miles was here. Ranger sniffed the ground, then threw his head back and whined, long, mournful, anguished, as if begging them to understand. Mark knelt beside him, placing a hand on the dog's back. "Show me, boy. What happened?" Ranger moved forward, nose pushing aside snow. He found a second footprint, then a third, then nothing, wiped clean by wind or dragged away. But then Ranger froze. He lifted his head toward the shadows of the deeper forest, ears pricked, body rigid. Mark felt it before he understood it. The silent electric certainty that someone had passed here, someone carrying a child. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faintest trace of formula milk. The smell was ghost-like, almost imaginary. But Ranger smelled it. He whined again, the most heartbreaking sound Mark had ever heard. Tom whispered, "They took Evan." Mark's chest constricted. "They didn't steal a body," he whispered. "They stole a living baby." Ranger nudged his leg, then looked toward the north, toward the dark forest that swallowed the trail. Mark clenched his fists. "We're not stopping. We're not slowing. We track them until the world ends." The snow fell harder, as if trying to hide the truth. But Ranger's nose had already found the thread, and Mark, heartbreaking, desperate, relentless Mark, would follow it until the mountain itself gave way. The storm gathered strength above the Wyoming highlands, as though the mountains themselves had summoned it. Clouds swollen with ice sank low over the pines, muting the world into a ghostly white labyrinth. Sheriff Mark Ellington drove through the winding forest road with the grim focus of a man racing against the heartbeat of winter itself. Snowflakes hammered against the windshield like shards of frozen feathers. The wipers brushed them away, but the road remained narrow, shifting, treacherous. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, body leaning forward with every turn, nostrils flaring as he traced the vanishing trail. His amber eyes glowed with alertness, flickering toward the window as if reading messages only a dog born for storms could understand. The German shepherd, old yet unbroken, had carried Mark through more winters than he could count, but never had his purpose felt sharper than on this night. Officer Tom Briggs sat beside Mark, scanning the woods with a tight jaw. Every mile north took them deeper into the uninhabited ridges where abandoned mines, forgotten cabins, and old ranger stations lay buried beneath decades of snowfall. It was the kind of terrain only locals and ghosts remembered, the kind of place someone could hide a van, a man, a child. Tom spoke first, voice low. "If Miles was forced up here, whoever took him knew the land." Mark nodded, hands tightening on the steering wheel. "And they knew we wouldn't catch up fast in a storm." Ranger let out a short, breathy bark, intent, urging. Mark's pulse quickened. "He smells something." Tom leaned closer to the window. "We're getting close." The road narrowed until it became almost a trail, half swallowed by snowdrifts. Branches clawed the sides of the SUV. The world outside the headlights was nothing but the shifting white of the storm. Then Ranger stiffened, barked once, barked again. Mark braked sharply. "He's got something." They climbed out into the icy air. The cold sliced through the layers of fabric like invisible knives. Ranger leapt into the snow, nose buried, tail rigid, moving left and right in swift arcs. His breath fogged in the thick white clouds. Mark followed the dog's path, shining his flashlight across the blank, snow-drenched world. A shape emerged ahead, a large structure, dark against the pale storm. The abandoned storage barn mentioned by the ranger at the checkpoint. The roof sagged beneath heavy snow. The windows were boarded, nails creaked in the wood as the wind pushed at the frame. Tom approached the door, gloved hand brushing the plank. "Someone's been here," he whispered, "recently." The lock was broken, fresh splinters untouched by snow. Ranger pressed his nose to the crack, then turned to bark sharply, a sound that told Mark the truth at once. Miles and Evan had passed through here. Mark pushed the door open. It groaned like something waking from a long bruise of sleep. Ranger entered first, shoulders low, eyes glowing in the dark like ancient embers. The beam of Mark's flashlight swept across the interior, a cavernous, dim space lined with dust-coated crates, rusted farm tools, and piles of lumber. But the center of the room told a different story. A makeshift nursery, a small baby's blanket, an open can of powdered formula, a diaper, used, rolled with the hurriedness of someone without time to spare. And there, lying beside a torn cardboard box, Evan's little cloth with the printed stars Helen had sewn by hand. Mark's vision blurred, his throat tightened around the air. Helen's cloth, he whispered. Ranger whined, tail low, as if feeling the ache running through Mark's bones. Tom stepped closer, crouching to examine the items. They kept the baby alive, Tom murmured. They were taking care of him. Whoever took him, they weren't trying to kill him. The words were a thin thread of hope in a night that felt endless. Mark forced himself to breathe. Then why take him? Tom stood. Ransom? No. Mark shook his head slowly. If it was ransom, they would have contacted us already. Ranger moved toward the far end of the barn. He pawed at a boarded-up window. His body trembled, not from cold, but from the intensity of the scent he was tracking. Mark hurried to him, shining the light. The boards on the window were nailed shut from the outside, but one panel had been slightly bent inward as if someone small had been pressed against it. Ranger whined, scraping at the wood with his paws. They were here, Mark whispered. Miles and Evan. Tom scanned the floor. Look. Footprints, half covered by blowing snow drifting in through cracks, led toward the rear exit. 2 adult sets, one hurried, one dragging. Miles was injured, Tom said softly. Or forced. Ranger sniffed the prints, letting out a trembling huff. He moved to the door, pressing his body against it, turning toward the forest beyond. Mark stepped to his side. The wind blasted the open doorway the moment Tom pushed it. Snow roared in, swirling, dancing in wild spirals as if the storm itself were alive. Ranger stepped out, nose angling north. The scent trail was faint, diluted by the rising blizzard. But the old dog still followed it with the precision of instinct, honed through a lifetime of search missions. Mark and Tom followed him across a narrow clearing. Snowflakes stung their faces. The sky above flickered with distant lightning, rare for winter, but storms in these mountains often broke rules. After a few minutes, Tom pointed through the veil of white. Tracks! The faint impression of vehicle tires, a van's pattern. Ranger confirmed with a low bark, trotting along the edge. Mark crouched. This direction heads deeper into the ridge. The cabin? Tom asked. Mark nodded slowly. The old cabin, a hunter's cabin, abandoned decades ago after a landslide. Locals whispered about it, claiming strange. Noises echoed from it at night. Some said it had been used by fugitives in past winters. Others said it was a place where storms liked to sit. In the context of a missing infant and a fleeing mortuary worker, it was the most dangerous possibility, and the most likely. Mark stood, snow clinging to his sleeves. We go now? Tom hesitated. They warned us about the storm. If conditions worsen, we'll lose visibility. If we wait, Mark said, voice breaking, we lose Evan. Ranger barked once, sharply. Agreement, urgency, truth. Without further words, they returned to the SUV. The tires bit through the snow as they began the final ascent toward the abandoned cabin. The storm snarled around them, slapping at the windows, shaking the frame of the vehicle with icy fists. Ranger sat pinned against the seat, eyes fixed on the white abyss ahead. The woods narrowed again as the trail climbed. Tree branches heavy with snow arched above, like the ribs of a sleeping giant. When the first outline of the cabin appeared through the storm, dark, square, lonely, Ranger rose from his seat with a low growl. Mark felt the vibration of it through the car. Tom went rigid. He senses them. Mark slowed the SUV and killed the headlights. Darkness swallowed them. Only the storm remained. "We go on foot," Mark whispered. Ranger pressed against the door, ready. Tom chambered around silently. The air outside hit them like a wall of knives. Snow slashed sideways. The cabin loomed ahead, its roof sagging under decades of storms, its windows blind with frost. The world had narrowed to a circle of gray-blue whirl and the sound of their own breathing. Ranger led them through the snow, body low, movements deliberate. He paused every few feet, sniffed, adjusted, continued. When they were close enough to see the front porch, Mark saw it. Fresh footprints, half filled with snow. Someone had been here recently. Ranger growled again, deeper this time. The kind of growl that meant danger is inside these walls. Mark's voice was barely audible. "This is it. This is where they took him." Snow roared around them like a living thing. The storm had swallowed the world, leaving only a cabin, a dog, and a man whose heart refused to break until he found his son. The storm roared over the high ridge like a living creature awakened from a long, icy sleep. Winds cut through the pines with the force of a blade, and the snow fell sideways in violent sheets that blurred the world into a single swirling mass of white. The old hunting cabin stood ahead, a dark, hunched silhouette battling the winter's fury. No lights glowed through its frost-covered windows, no smoke rose from the crooked chimney, yet every instinct in Sheriff Mark Ellington's body told him they were not alone. Ranger stepped forward, each paw pressing into the deep snow with deliberate caution. His tail was low and rigid, his ears flicked forward, and his breath puffed like steam from a small furnace. Even at 10 years old, his body retained the quiet intensity of a seasoned K9, muscles coiled beneath his thick winter coat, ready to move with the precision burned into him by years of training. Tom Briggs walked close behind, rifle held tight across his chest. His dark skin glistened with cold sweat despite the freezing air, his breath sharp and focused. Tom had always been the steady force in Mark's career, a man with a calm heartbeat even when chaos pressed in. But now, his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, sensing that something about this cabin, this moment, could break everything. Mark lifted a hand. The team behind them, 3 tactical officers summoned as reinforcement, halted instantly. The storm's howl drowned nearly all other sound, but Ranger's body language spoke with perfect clarity. Danger, close, inside. Mark exhaled slowly, grounding himself. "Tom," he murmured, "you take the right flank. Ranger and I will come through the front." Tom nodded once and disappeared into the storm's veil, moving with the ghostly precision of an officer trained to read storms like maps. 2 tactical officers moved behind Tom. Another crouched with Mark. The blizzard hammered into them harder, as if the mountain were trying to swallow their footsteps. They reached the porch. Snow had drifted knee-deep across the boards. Fresh boot prints, large, heavy, led directly to the cabin door. Ranger sniffed them, then turned his head toward Mark with a look that tightened something inside the sheriff's chest. This was the scent he had been following for hours, the scent that had mixed with the faint trace of formula milk, with fear, with desperation, the scent that had belonged to the men who took Evan. Mark pressed a hand to Ranger's shoulder, steadying him. For a moment, he let his eyes close. The image of his son, small, fragile, wrapped in the blanket Helen had chosen, the memory hit him with the gentle, unbearable force of a collapsing world. He opened his eyes. "We end it tonight," he whispered. Ranger nudged his hand softly as if saying he understood. The wind slammed into the cabin walls, shaking loose old snow. Mark signaled the tactical officer with him. Together they moved toward the door. The hinges were old, rust-choked. The wood was warped, but faint light flickered from the cracks, orange and trembling. A fire was lit inside. Someone was awake. Mark pressed his ear to the door. Muffled voices drifted out, low, tense. One voice complaining, another snapping back, impatient. A third noise, soft, rhythmic. The sound of a baby breathing. Mark felt the world tilt beneath him. Ranger growled, a deep rumble vibrating through the air. Mark raised 3 fingers, counting silently. 3, 2, 1. He slammed his boot against the door. It burst inward with a crack of splintering wood. Snow exploded into the room behind him. Inside, the scene unfolded in a heartbeat. A man sat slumped in a chair, half asleep, rifle beside him. Another stood near the fireplace, phone pressed to his ear, pacing like an animal trapped in a cage. And there, beside the hearth, was a makeshift crib, an overturned wooden crate lined with blankets. Evan lay inside, wrapped tightly, his tiny chest rising and falling in sharp, frightened breaths. Ranger shot through the doorway with electric speed. The man in the chair jolted awake, grabbing for his rifle. But Ranger was faster. He lunged, using the silent takedown technique learned long ago, pressing his full weight onto the man's arm and chest, pinning him before he could shout. Mark sprinted to the crib, heart tearing open when he saw Evan's eyes flicker at the sound of his voice. Evan, I'm here. Dad's here." The man with the phone spun around, hand reaching for the pistol at his waist. The tactical officer stepped in, silent as a shadow, striking him across the shoulder. The man crumpled to the floor. Tom burst through the back door. At the same moment, the storm howled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Within seconds, the room was filled with officers, Rangers' growls, wind screaming against the roof, and Mark's heartbeat pounding like thunder. And then, silence. Evan whimpered softly, as if knowing the moment had shifted. Mark scooped him into his arms, holding him with a trembling gentleness, afraid that touching him too firmly would break the miracle in front of him. The baby blinked, face flushed with warmth from the fire. His tiny fingers curled around Mark's coat. Mark pressed his forehead to his son's, tears slipping hot down his frozen cheeks. "You're alive," he whispered, voice breaking. "You're alive." Tom exhaled, relief melting the tension from his body. "Let's get him out of here." Mark nodded, but Ranger stood at the cabin's entrance, staring outside with focused intensity. The storm raged on, but Ranger didn't move. He wasn't listening for danger inside the cabin anymore. He was listening to the silence beyond, confirming the trail ended here, confirming the nightmare was over. Mark walked to him, Evan in his arms. "You found him," he said softly. "You brought him home." Ranger leaned against Mark's leg, eyes warm, proud, exhausted. Outside, sirens approached, delayed by the storm, but finally arriving. The wind began to soften, as if the mountains themselves were releasing a long-held breath. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. Evan sighed in his father's arms. And in that fragile glow, between the fury of winter and the warmth of rescue, Mark Ellington felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. Winter loosened its grip on the Wyoming Valley one breath at a time. After weeks of storms that carved deep scars across the mountains, the season began to shift. The wind softened first, losing its sharp edge. Then the clouds thinned, revealing sunlight that glimmered over rooftops like liquid gold poured slowly across the frozen town. Snow still blanketed everything in white, but now it sparkled with quiet warmth, as if the long winter had grown tired and chosen to finally rest. Sheriff Mark Ellington stood at the large window of his living room, holding Evan close to his chest. The baby breathed softly, head nestled beneath Mark's chin. For days after the rescue, Mark found himself returning to this window again and again, almost in disbelief, as though every look at his son were a reminder that what he held was real, living, warm, a heartbeat against his own. Helen entered quietly behind him. She had changed too. No longer carrying the hollow look of a grieving mother, she now moved with renewed strength, though her steps were gentle, careful, as if she feared any sudden motion might shake loose the miracle she had been granted. Helen's long brown hair was tied loosely, her features soft again, touched by the faint rosy color that had been absent for weeks. She reached toward Evan, brushing a fingertip across his tiny cheek. "He's sleeping better," she whispered. Mark nodded. "He knows he's home." Helen rested her forehead lightly against Mark's shoulder. Silence filled the room, a peaceful silence, not the heavy, unbearable one that had ruled their lives before the truth unfolded. This silence carried gratitude, healing, a beginning. Outside, fresh snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. Not the violent snow of the blizzard, not the storm that had nearly swallowed them, but soft flakes, gentle, harmless, almost musical in the way they fell. Mark watched them, feeling something in his chest settle at last. Then came the bark, short, strong, familiar, Ranger. The German shepherd stood at the front door, tail relaxed, eyes bright with anticipation. At 10 years old, he carried the slow movements of age, but his gaze still burned with that unwavering loyalty. His winter coat was thick and silvered at the muzzle, giving him the look of a warrior whose battles had carved wisdom rather than weariness. Mark smiled and turned to Helen. "Ready?" She nodded, bundling Evan in a tiny winter coat, blue, with a soft hood that made him look like a small Arctic fox. When they stepped into the cold air outside, Ranger trotted ahead proudly, leaving prints in the fresh snow like calligraphy drawn by a steady hand. The morning sun lit him from behind, giving him a quiet, dignified glow. The town square lay only a few minutes away. Wooden storefronts lined the street, their windows decorated with frost patterns resembling delicate feathers. People had gathered there, townsfolk, officers, a few reporters, even retirees who rarely left their homes in winter. The square had been cleared of snow, and at its center stood a small wooden platform draped with the American flag. Tom Briggs, wearing a crisp dress uniform, greeted Mark with a warm clasp of the shoulder. Tom's face, usually stern, held a softness today, relief still echoing through every breath he took. "You ready?" Tom asked. Mark looked down at Evan, sleeping in Helen's arms, then at Ranger, who sat beside him like a knight carved from living stone. "Yeah," Mark said quietly. "I am." The ceremony began with a hush that fell over the crowd like reverence. The mayor stepped to the microphone, his voice warm and resonant. "Today, we honor bravery, not just from our officers, but from a companion who has served this town with a heart larger than any storm." He gestured toward Ranger. The dog sat upright, chest broad, ears alert. Despite age pressing at his joints, he held his posture proudly, as if fully aware of the moment. "Years ago," the mayor continued, "Ranger became a legend among our search and rescue teams. He saved lives, guided lost souls home, faced blizzards without flinching." He paused, letting the weight of those memories settle. And this winter, he saved yet another life, the most precious life in this town. He led Sheriff Ellington and his team through the worst storm of the year. He found the trail no human could follow. He fought through the snow until the child was found. A ripple of emotion swept through the crowd. A few people wiped tears. Helen gripped Mark's arm gently. "And so today," the mayor said, "we award Ranger the Medal of Valor for the second time in his remarkable life." Applause erupted, thunderous, joyful, echoing through the square. Ranger tilted his head slightly as if humbly accepting the sound, then lifted his chin when the mayor approached with the small silver medallion. Mark knelt beside Ranger, holding the dog steady as the medal was placed gently around his neck. The old shepherd's eyes softened, not with pride, but with something deeper, something ancient, the quiet nobility of a creature who gave everything simply because love demanded it. "He saved our son," Helen whispered to no one in particular, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ranger turned and nudged her hand gently, then sniffed Evan's hood, as if checking one last time to confirm that the child was safe. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes more, but its warmth lingered long after the applause faded. People came to give Ranger soft pats, to offer words of gratitude, to celebrate the return of a child they had all mourned. As the crowd eventually dispersed, Mark led his family back home, moving slowly through the snow-packed street. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky shades of amber and rose. The entire town seemed to glow. Back at the house, Mark carried Evan into the backyard, a peaceful place edged by tall pines and a wide meadow that turned silver each winter. Snow lay soft across the ground, sparkling in the new sunlight. Mark set Evan down onto a thick blanket on the ground. The baby blinked, cooed, and then crawled straight toward Ranger. The dog stood patiently, lowering his head as Evan reached out with small, wobbly hands. Evan tugged gently at Ranger's ear, laughing, a tiny, bubbling laugh that melted every frozen edge of Mark's heart. Ranger stayed still, eyes half closed, a warm rumble of contentment vibrating in his chest. Helen stepped beside Mark, resting her head on his shoulder. "He loves Ranger," she murmured. "He always did," Mark whispered, "even when we didn't know." Helen looked up at him. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Ranger hadn't been there that day? Mark swallowed. His throat felt tight. No, he said quietly, because that world doesn't exist. Ranger didn't just find Evan. He brought us back from something we wouldn't have survived. Ranger looked at them then, the soft, golden eyes of an old guardian who had seen death, storms, and miracles. He stepped closer, resting his head against Mark's leg. Mark placed a hand on the dog's neck, voice barely a whisper. You led us through the darkest part of winter. You brought my family home. The snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting gently, silently, as if blessing the scene below. And in that moment, in the quiet after the storm, one truth shimmered like sunlight on snow. Sometimes what saves us is not a blazing miracle, but the quiet loyalty of a heart that refuses to give up. Sometimes the miracles God sends do not arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come quietly through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, or through the courage God places in ordinary people when they feel they have nothing left. This story reminds us that even in the coldest winters of our lives, God walks beside us. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only after the storm has passed. In our everyday struggles, when we feel tired, lonely, or uncertain, faith invites us to look for those small, gentle miracles that God places in our path. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family with peace and protection. And if you believe in the quiet miracles He sends, type Amen in the comments.